welcome back to a new episode of The New Unfiltered. I am very excited today because I have a guest in the studio. Now, in particular, I am very excited about this because he is not a guest that I would think would be easy to get in, and he just confirmed that with me because he is a big executive for one of my favorite, not only restaurant groups, but that owns many of my favorite restaurants. I also have a bunch of notes here. So if you guys see me looking down, all of the guests today, I did a ton more prep than usual because they're all just that cool. So I'm going to introduce you, Chip, and then I will let you introduce yourself properly. But Chip Wade is the Chief Executive Officer of Union Square Hospitality Group. He's responsible for further enhancing and evolving the company's culture, driving an even greater experience for guests, and bolstering the excellence and growth of its business. Chip joined the Union Square Hospitality Group executive team as president in 2019, following a rich 30-year career in operational leadership in the hospitality industry. And in 2022, you were named Chief Executive Officer. So before I get into more about Chip, for those who don't know, Union Square Hospitality Group is founded by Danny Meyer, who also founded Shake Shack. So this group not only knows everything about the restaurant group, but so much about how to properly build and scale larger companies as well as hire. So Chip, I am just honored to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Very excited.
Well, you also grew up on the East Coast, myself in particular did too. And so all of these restaurant groups and chains, TGI Fridays, everything. Yeah. I love that you just said you were also, I think, a manager.
Oh, yeah.
When was that?
So my career in the restaurant industry, I'll go back.
Yeah.
I was 15. I got my first job at a fast food restaurant. Okay. And so I was hired at a Dunkin' Donuts restaurant to clean the parking lot, sweep the floors, and mop the floors. And that is how I came to love the restaurant and hospitality industry. Specifically to your question, I was just coming out of college in 1985. I got hired by TGI Fridays, which then was what I describe as the granddaddy of casual dining brands. It was the biggest and the best at that time. And my time in Boston was 1990 to 1994 of running the TGI Fridays on the corner of Newbury and Exeter, and one of my favorite cities in Boston.
Exeter, that's how far from actually like downtown Boston though?
Yeah, it's in the Back Bay section of Boston, okay. So 10 minutes, 15 minutes from downtown or the financial district of Boston.
So growing up, did you have family that was in restaurants? Because anyone who's listening is like, I've worked as a bartender, or maybe they were in the kitchen. From what I know about the restaurant industry, it is hard. Yeah. It is late nights. It can be very, people can be so rude. I mean, why that?
Yeah, so the answer is no. I was raised by a single mom. My mom often had 2 and 3 jobs. She did have a job for a brief period of time as a pantry cook in a restaurant. But outside of that, there was no one in my family. When I shared with my mom that I wanted to go to culinary school, she was dead set against it, right? In part because probably her experience at that independent restaurant, I grew up outside of Philadelphia, was probably not great. And like most parents, there's this notion of, I'd love for my son to be a business person or a doctor or a lawyer. There was no one in my family that had passion for food and hospitality.
Were you like the kid growing up who was cooking in the kitchen or recipe testing?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time. My grandmother helped to raise us. Okay. And so my love for food came from watching my grandmother in the kitchen. She was an amazing cook. She was a great baker, and she loved to serve. And I tell this story a lot, which is when I came home from culinary school, I went to culinary school in Rhode Island, I would take the train back to Philadelphia. And often I would go right to my grandmother's house before I went to my mom's house. And it was because my grandmother was so willing to cook for me the minute I walked through the door. And she did it with such love. And so, yes, I loved watching my grandmother not just cook, but present the food in such a loving way. And long before I knew what hospitality was, it was, I'm here to serve you and ensure that that you're nourished, both in terms of the food, but also spiritually.
Yeah. Do you have siblings?
I have 3 siblings, yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
growing up, you guys similar ages or?
Yeah, I have an older brother who's 5 years older. My older sister is 2 years, and then me, and then my younger brother. We're very close.
It reminds me when I was growing up, my mom can't cook, so your grandmother seems way cooler. But she would have like a snack tray for me every time I would walk in the door. Now, anytime I even go home and on the way, I'm like, Mom, please make me a snack tray because it just feels so like nostalgic.
Yes.
But tell me about like growing up in Philly. I mean, Philly also has an amazing restaurant scene.
Yep.
There's so many good restaurants there now. But I mean, back in the day, was it like safe? Were you going to public school, private school?
Yeah, so no, I would say I grew up in a town, essentially Chester, Pennsylvania, which is 40 minutes outside of Philadelphia. It is, and it was and still is, an economically depressed community. And I spent probably 50% of my time in Chester and then 50% of my time in media. And we did not have the finances to go to restaurants, right? We ate 99.9% of our meals at home. And then as I got older in the high school years and got a job, then whatever money that I would spend, it was usually in fast food restaurants. I clearly remember when the first Wendy's came to our community. It was a very big deal. But again, all of my passion and love started from Dunkin' Donuts and really one man who was my manager. I was, again, 15 years old. I remember thinking he was 30, and I thought, wow, this guy's old. But on his counsel, he advised me to go to culinary school. Each year that I was there, sophomore, junior, and senior, he gave me more responsibility. I went from cleaning the toilets and mopping the floors to working the register. And then by the time I was a senior in high school, I was making the donuts, which, by the way, when you're 17 making donuts and you can eat all the donuts you want, it's like it's insane. Yeah. But his counsel and advice of saying, you're pretty good at this, you should go to culinary school, and obviously resonated with me. So, yeah.
Okay, so back me up. You're 15, 16, and you're like mopping toilets and enjoying it?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed, first of all, it's your first job, right? And so I wanted to work because I wanted to help my mom, and I wanted money in my wallet, if you will. But I enjoyed being with people, right? There were regulars, if you remember the show Cheers, right? There were regulars that came into our Dunkin' Donuts every single day. And these older gentlemen, again, I'm 15 and 16, they were in their mid-50s, and they'd stop by in the morning before they would get on the train. On the weekends, we would see the same families. And so what I really enjoyed was the connection, the connectivity, and meeting people and listening to people and learning about their lives and why they came into this particular Dunkin' Donut. And as I said, the bonus of eating all the donuts that I wanted was a big plus.
Oh, I love that. I do love donuts. Yeah. There's nothing better. It's like you're Ben Affleck, but like in the restaurant group.
Exactly.
Okay, so you're working at like Dunkin' and then these other smaller ones. Were you thinking of going to college? Was that, it seems like your mom was really in support of this, but this is very non-traditional in a way. Like, you could have gone to traditional business school and had a normal job as an accountant or a lawyer.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to go to college not because my mom influenced me. My uncle, who was a huge influence in me and my siblings, has 2 master's degree and a doctorate's degree. And he's the only person in our family that had multiple degrees. And so I looked up to him. And so I knew I wanted to go to college. The manager in Dunkin' Donuts heavily influenced me to focus in on culinary. And what I eventually came to kind of understand was I went to culinary school because I loved cooking and I loved food, but I never aspired to be a chef. As I finished year 1 in culinary and then year 2, which is an associate's degree, the general premise was I want to run a business. The business would be restaurants, and I never wanted to be fooled by a chef. Like I wanted to be able to comfortably navigate in and around the kitchen and essentially not be BS'd by a chef. And so that was a driving factor of me going to culinary school. And then when I graduated, I immediately went back and got a degree in hotel and restaurant management.
Were you nervous about going to culinary school and not necessarily leaving with a job?
Well, I was nervous going to culinary school. The answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In part because I wasn't, this is, again, before the internet, right? You filled all the paperwork online, you would get a brochure, but there was no videos for me to watch. I really wasn't sure what the hell I was getting into. But I found pretty quickly that I loved it. And culinary school was these classes that we would break down. So 14 days in bake shop and 14 days in pastry. My first class was 14 days in meat cutting. And my only experience with meat was going with my mom to the supermarket. And the first week we had to break down a cow, right? A half of a cow. That you would ultimately get a 16-ounce ribeye or an 8-ounce fillet. So you had to learn the art and the craft of meat cutting. So yes, I was nervous going to culinary school. And the other factor that I was nervous about was I had no idea how we were going to pay for it. I remember being early November of my freshman year on the 6th floor of my dorm, literally crying on my bed. And I'm like, this weight of, I'm 7 hours away from home. My mom dropped me off 2 months prior, and I can't, excuse my language in advance, I'm like, holy shit, I gotta figure this out. And it was, I had to get a job so that I could continue and afford college. So I was nervous on both fronts.
You answered the question because I was going to say, you have 4 siblings?
Yeah.
Yeah, single.
Three siblings. There's 4 of us.
Yeah, single mom, 4 kids. Like, how was she going to pay for it? But you were on your own, 100%.
I was on my own. My mom helped me as best she could, which was not a lot. I obviously applied for Pell Grants, and I went to a bank by myself and filled out all the paperwork by myself, which is a vast different than how kids go to school today. But it was an awakening for me at 18 of going, you are it, and you got to figure it out.
So nice to hear someone successful say that, because I remember when I was 17 and I was failing out of public school, and my mom so casually was just like, what's your plan? Like, you have this blog, but I can't afford college, and I had a really traumatic childhood, so there was no money, and it was almost like the way that you'd be like, what do you want for lunch? She was like, so what are you going to do? And I was like, what? But I had such a similar moment where I was like, it's kind of, this is it. Like, but I didn't also feel like I needed a plan B. It was almost like it made me rely on myself more. Would you agree with that? That's 100%. How you felt? Yeah.
I mean, that moment that I just described, and if I close my eyes, I can visualize a Saturday, rainy in Rhode Island, crying as I'm like, okay, enough tears, just figure this out. And for me, the figuring it out was obviously getting a job and figuring out a way to work 30 hours a week, go to school, study, and then making sacrifice. Because this awakening of saying, what the rest of my contemporaries did on the weekend, the campus of Johnson & Wells, where I went to culinary school, abutted Brown University. So there was energy and vitality. And when all of my contemporaries were out having a great time Friday and Saturday, I was working. But I was willing to make that I had to make that sacrifice, and I was cognizant of that. I was making these choices.
Now that you work at such a large and successful restaurant group, I'm curious the way that you described your kind of the first boss with the donuts, right? It almost seems like maybe he really saw something in you that perhaps is a bit different than the other employees who are working there at that age. So now working at Union Square, do you find that you also can kind of see people who maybe have a bit of a non-traditional brain when it comes to like thinking and innovation when they come to you with ideas, or do you kind of look at everyone who works at the group as very equal and all the same?
Well, you can't look at everyone the same, first and foremost, right? And to answer your first question, the answer is yes. I see individuals in our organization. They could be sous chefs, it could be a waiter or waitress, or it could be someone at the home office, a director, that has this energy, they have the vitality, they bring what we often talk about, this sunny side of the street. Like there are individuals, as Danny and I often talk about, there are people who constantly walk on the sunny side of the street. They're upbeat, they're positive, And then there are people that just like walking on the rainy side of the street, right? And so there are a number of people in our organization that kind of are, as we describe them, 51 percenters. They're upbeat, positive. They have a high degree of empathy and compassion. And I love working with those individuals. And the last thing I would add about those individuals, they're very curious. And one of the things that I often talk about is, for me, this 40-year journey to stay inquisitive and curious. And I like people that want to learn, that want to grow, and color outside the lines.
Yeah, oh, that's such a good, it's cute, but also such a good solid way to think about it. Do you find though that you were like that, or that the people you know who are on the sunny side versus the rainy side, what makes someone like that? You know, is it the same that some people pursue entrepreneurship and become successful and some people don't? Do you think you're born like that?
I think there's some combination of being born like that and the other combination of just experiences and people that have shaped and influenced you, right? And so, you know, maybe role modeling or watching others, right? I was this wonky kid at 16, in addition to having a job. When my contemporaries wanted to get Sports Illustrated, I asked my mom for a copy of Business Week. Like, I knew I wanted to be in business, right? And I can tell you names of CEOs of companies in 1976 and 77. Most of them have passed away, but I was fanatically interested in business. And as I got older, there were prominent black leaders like Ken Chenault, Clarence Otis, who I saw from afar, and they helped to influence. So I think it's a little bit of both.
I'm intrigued why you never became an entrepreneur, because you have such entrepreneurial traits almost about you.
Yeah, there was a period after I got out of culinary school where a friend of mine, sadly, he passed away a number of years, one of my closest friends. He and I went on this path to open our own restaurant. And he was going to be the chef, and I was going to run the front of the house. It's the only period in my career when I thought about the notion of being an entrepreneur. I've enjoyed working in larger enterprises.
Yeah.
I believe that I have the capacity and the desire and the love to help shape the next generation of leaders. And working in larger organizations has allowed me to do that.
How much of your career and your success has been attributed to any mentors that you've had or currently have?
Yeah, so I think about, to a large degree, and I think about mentor and mentorship from a couple of lenses. One is, I've always had mentors that I know and trust and call on 3, 4, 5 times a year, right? There's a gentleman, his name is Tom Fair. I've known Tom for 40 years. And there was a period in my 30s and 40s, I rarely made a career move without calling Tom.
Why?
Because Tom has this wonderful way of just bouncing ideas back to me, of challenging me. Tom's not that much older than me. I viewed him as, and still today, as a big brother, but he's been a mentor that 4 or 5 times a year, I would just say, Tom, I'm struggling with this issue. Do you have any ideas, right? So that's one thing. I then believe the importance of having, as I just described, mentors from afar, right? These are leaders that when I was 30 and 40, they were doing commencement speeches at universities, or they were on the cover of Fortune or Business Week, and I was just in awe of them, right? I mentioned Ken Chenault as an example. Jeffrey Immelt, who was a former CEO of GE, Indra Nooyi, who is, I think, just a brilliant, brilliant leader. Yeah. And when you're 40 and 45 and you're like, these people are high intellect, high emotional quotient, so they understand the soft skills, they understand strategy and business. And so I looked up to them from afar with the presumption that I would never meet them. And fortunately, I've met Ken and we've had dinner. I had a great conversation with Indra in the middle of the pandemic. Okay. And so I've long believed and often prescribed to young adults, have mentors that you know and trust and talk to throughout the year, but find a mentor from afar and keep watching them. right? And I always said, when Indra Nooyi writes a book, I'm going to buy it. She wrote a book 2 years ago. I might have been the first person in line. So how I go about, finding a mentor and then actually connecting them is this level of curiosity, and I used that earlier, and courage, right? It's a funny story, but I'm always open. When I joined USHG, Danny and I were having a conversation, and Danny is obviously brilliant and smart, highly engaging, but he's also wonderful at this notion of connecting dots, as the term we use it, which is connecting dots with people so that you can learn about them. And in early discussion, he was sharing with me he had just had a meeting or an interaction with Ken Chenault, and my eyes lit up, and I'm like, Danny, I would love to meet him one day.
Who is this person?
Ken Chenault. Ken is the former chairman and CEO of American Express.
Okay.
At the time when there were not a lot of black CEOs in business in general, Ken is what I would describe as the gold standard of CEOs, irrespective of his race, but he has been the gold standard for business. And he took over the CEO role a few months before 9/11 and had to manage that. Yes, a very large enterprise through a very difficult period. And so I think I was an officer of a restaurant company called Darden based in Orlando when Ken got promoted. I was a VP, just promoted to vice president, and I was, as a young black executive, to see a rare black CEO take over a Fortune 400 company, it's awe-inspiring. And so back to the story with Danny and I, and Danny had this relationship and interaction with Ken, and I just had the courage to say to Danny, with your help, I would like to meet Ken Chenault. And I'm very fortunate now to be on the receiving end of similar situations where young women, young black adults want to interface with me or spend time with me and learn from me. And I think I have a responsibility to make sure that I am giving back to the next generation of leaders, specifically women and people of color.
That's also why I'm so appreciative you took the time out of your insanely busy schedule to come here, right? Because, someone can message you on LinkedIn and ask you to mentor them, but I can almost guarantee you probably don't have the time for that all day. But spending an hour with me, right, and the people who listen to this, it's like free wisdom from someone like yourself. So, looking back to you growing up black and in Philadelphia and where you are now as an executive, for anyone who is in a similar position, what advice would you give to them? I mean, you've had to break down, I assume, a lot more doors perhaps than somebody else who grew up in a wealthy white community to work in the food and restaurant world. What advice do you have for that little you?
I'm smiling because I'm going back to an earlier question that you asked of whether or not I went to private school or public school, right? And I went to public school. We had no funds to go to private school. My advice to young adults are a couple of things. Number one, which I always begin with, is this notion of being curious. Be curious about yourself. Be curious about others. I've used this term before, which is I've tried to maintain an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. It's a wonky phrase, but if you think about this notion of unquenchable thirst for knowledge, you're always thirsty, right? So that's number one, is be curious. Find a career or hobby that interests you and then keep learning about it. In my case, it happened to be food in restaurants. I have two sons, one's 27, one's soon to be 25. And at 14, the oldest son had an interest in sports and sports management, right? And he stayed curious about that, and he has followed his dream and now works for a WNBA franchise. So my first bit of advice is to stay curious. My second advice is to understand and embrace complexity and uncertainty, right? My career has not been linear, and for anyone that has this false narrative that your career is just going to be linear, I'm here to tell you that's just not the case, right? I've had setbacks, I've been restructured twice. I've been fired twice, right? And so you have to, number three, is have the perseverance and this relentless focus to believe in yourself despite those setbacks, despite the restructuring. My last advice is to enjoy what you do, right? Whether you are in a career or job, have fun at it, enjoy it. If you're on a personal day and you're going to a museum or bookstore or sport, enjoy where you are at that moment and to ensure that you have balance in your life.
Before we went, we kind of started recording, we were talking about influence.
Yeah.
And nowadays it's so different, right?
Yeah.
The difference between an influencer when you were growing up, I consider someone like you an influencer.
Yeah.
Now, you have these young people who all they want to do is be influencers and amass so much of a following online, but like you have to still follow your kind of footsteps and start from the bottom and make your way up to become successful.
Yeah.
Do you think though that in this day and age, people still have to work as hard as you did to get to where you or say Danny is in comparison to what it was, how it is now where you can just amass that kind of success and fame overnight?
Yeah, I think the answer is an emphatic yes. From my perspective, there's no replacement for hard work, right? Of putting in the hours, of the dedication, and for lack of a better term, earning your stripes. It's a rare percent of an individual that can have a hockey stick of a career. It's an interesting dynamic period that we're in because of social media and cameras and influencers, and it's our desire to be liked and loved, and all of a sudden someone has amassed a crazy number of followings, 750,000, 1 million, and I'm sure I'm going to offend someone, and they actually haven't done anything, right? They haven't done the work of working on themselves, the work that it takes to have an impact in their careers. I remember probably 14, 15 years ago, there was a young man, much younger than me, who's saying, well, how do I get to your level? And there was this, as he's asking that, the previous statements were about entitlement, and I went to a really good school, and he might have been 28, and I'm like, yeah, you just got to do the work, right? You have to do the work.
Yeah.
I mentioned my older son. I'll talk briefly about my younger son, Mitchell, who decided to follow me in the hospitality and restaurant business. And I said to Mitchell, I'm happy that you aspire to be in this hospitality business, but you must know that you are going to work when the rest of your contemporaries are off, right? That's Mother's Day and Father's Day and Easter. When all of your friends are somewhere on July 4th, you're going to be working. And if you can get comfortable with this idea of working and putting in the hours when your friends are off, you'll have a great career. But if you're going to be sad because your friends are off Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and you're working, you should find another industry.
Yeah. So different. How much of your time early on in restaurants did you spend, holidays and everything, working?
Every holiday.
Yep.
Every TGI Fridays, as I mentioned, I joined them in 1985. I think we were closed Christmas. That was the only day.
How kind of them.
Yeah. And, when you're the young manager, again, at this point, I wasn't a general manager. I'm a restaurant manager, and my GM had a wife and 3 kids, and I was the youngest man on the totem pole. And guess what? I worked Thanksgiving, and I worked Christmas. So the vast majority of my career early on was working those holidays. And because I grew up as an hourly rank, I literally have done every position in the restaurant industry. I have a fond appreciation for the work that they do. Yeah. I've been a dishwasher. I've been a line cook. And even today, when some of our restaurants are open for holidays, I make a point to go in and stop in and shake hands and say hello and hug people. And I'm very transparent. It's not like I'm working a station. My presence there is just to look people in the eye and tell them how much I appreciate that they are spending their day servicing and providing hospitality to our guests.
Yeah, and I bet they respect that so much, right? Because if someone had done that for you when you were doing that.
Absolutely.
And people remember that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you're also on the board of some companies like Cracker Barrel, which is so funny because, I mean, when I was growing up, and my mom also really struggled, you know, when I was younger, but Chili's and Cracker Barrel and TGI Fridays and all of these are just changed. But when I talk to so many people nowadays, especially if they grew up wealthier in any capacity than I did, a lot of people are like, I would never step foot in an Applebee's. Yeah. I buy my dad $200 worth of Applebee's gift cards every Christmas.
That's awesome.
But now, you know, Union Square Hospitality Group owns some very nice restaurants, along with ones like Daily Provisions, which are what you call fine casual.
Exactly right.
So I'm curious, what was the first kind of foray into Union Square Hospitality? You're working, or you're in school, and then you leave school, and what was the next step?
So when I graduated from college, I, again, went to TGI Fridays and spent 14 years plus or minus at TGI Fridays. Okay. And at Fridays, I had several roles. One is an operator, running a restaurant, then running multiple restaurants. The title was Director of Operations, and I had about 8 restaurants, most of them in New England and a handful in northern New Jersey. I also spent 6 years of my time at TGI Fridays in the HR discipline. So I was an HR generalist for a while, supporting about 90 restaurants. Apparently someone thought I was good at that, and I became head of domestic HR for TGI Fridays, and I moved to Dallas. And I'm very transparent. I was not an HR expert. What I was fairly good at was understanding the importance of having a great culture, training and developing talent. I was very good at organizational design, and I was very good at cascading HR policies and material that was created at the headquarters. During that period, I decided to go back and get my master's degree. When I finished my master's, the CEO, a wonderful gentleman by the name of Wally Doolin, asked me to move into development. So after 6+ years in HR, I was asked to work in non-traditional development. My job was to wake up every day and put Fridays in airports, sports stadiums, military bases, and it was 60% of my job was negotiating deals. The rest was design and construction. And so I did that for 14 years. I left Fridays in 1999, and I joined Darden Restaurants, headquartered in Orlando, Florida. And I initially joined at the Olive Garden brand.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm very familiar with Olive Garden.
Same.
I ran a remodel program for Olive Garden. And then I became Senior Vice President of Development for a new brand that Darden created called Smoky Bones.
Okay.
And in that role, third of the job was real estate acquisition. So Smoky Bones had just received board approval for national rollout. At the time I joined, there were 9 restaurants. By the time I left, we had some 90+ restaurants. A third of my time was real estate, a third of my time was designing, and then a third of my time was construction. And we had a wonderful team. I've always taken a lot of pride in building really competent, strong, vibrant teams. Yeah. And I'll finish it out. I got recruited to go run Legal Seafoods in Boston as the chief operating officer, so I did that for almost 2 years. I rejoined Darden in 2006 as a zone vice president for Red Lobster.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
You asked me something along the lines of why I'm so infatuated by you or like Union Square Hospitality Group. And it's because I don't think anyone thinks there is this much that goes on, and why would anyone know behind the scenes of like one chain. Now, even with a Union Square Hospitality Group and the real estate, and it's insane to me because there's so much business behind restaurants, right?
Such a brilliant commentary by you. When guests go into one of our restaurants that Danny has curated and created, Union Square Cafe as an example, his first restaurant, it's not just the chef and hiring the staff, right? It's finding the right vendors. They're part of the ecosystem of the restaurant industry. The women who bring us, and men, the companies that bring us the linen, the produce companies that we procure from, the meat purveyors. It's an ecosystem that drives the entire restaurant industry, and without them, our brands could never come to life. I remember being on the call in the middle of the pandemic with Danny and Marcus Samuelson, my amazing restaurateur here in New York City. And we have long wanted to have a collaboration with Marcus and his creative mind. And Danny and Marcus and I were on the call of finding a way, maybe we can do a collaboration and open a restaurant together. These two entrepreneurs spent more time talking about the artwork, the lighting, the decor, the music, and I was just in awe. And to your point, it's not just an 8-ounce filet and wonderful vegetables on the plate. It's the full experience that we want to bring to life.
Yeah.
And I was just watching these two brilliant restaurateurs talk about all of the components, the entire ecosystem.
There's so much in that. And I mean, it's the same with this new day and age of even something as small as a coffee shop, right? That someone co-works from. Yeah. I don't love museums and stuff, but I love restaurants. And it's a vibe when you go in. And it's so interesting, too, because someone could have a really shitty meal, but be like, it's a great vibe. You know, go there, but the food sucks, but it's a good vibe. So what do you feel like is the perfect balance? How do you come up with that, with finding really good chef and really good staff in a very high turnover industry, and then doing the vibe, the architecture, the interior, the music?
Well, the vibe of a restaurant, the individual restaurant and the company, really starts with the purpose and the behaviors and the values of the organization, right? And Danny has long, and he wrote about this in his book, had a philosophy, a business practice that we call enlightened hospitality, right? And it is our philosophy that starts with our employees first, understanding that the health, the welfare of the workforce, the people that bring restaurants to life, are so important. We have 5 stakeholders. They're all important, including our investors, but we place the employee first. And what creates a vibe is having a really strong culture, having a set of core behaviors that we recite and share and bring to life every single day. And part of that is building a great team, talking a lot about the importance of having a great team, and then looking for individuals that have that 51% that we talk about, right? And I'll give you an interesting analogy. You know, when you're in school, you want to get 100 on your tests, right? And at USHG, we talk about that's always our goal, is to get 100 on your tests. And the way we think about talent in people is 51% of your test is made up of these enlightened hospitality skills of compassion, curiosity, empathy, right? And then 49% of your test is made up of the technical skills that you bring to the job. And what we talk about is you can be the best cook in the world, but if you don't bring the empathy and compassion, curiosity, great listening skills, we don't want you working at USHG. And so it starts with building a great culture and bringing that to life every single day, and that then feeds to the vibe. Then you sprinkle in great decor and great artwork, wonderful music, the energy of the sunny side of the street people, and then I think you have a wonderful restaurant. The goal for us, and when we think about designing and executing on restaurants, is never to put food in people's belly, right? Because they can go many places. If the goal is just to put food in their belly, they can go to Whole Foods and then go in the prepared section. They can go to Wegmans. They can go to fast food. They can cook at home. But for us, they want to be part of something unique and special and memorable, and we try to bring that to life every day.
Chip, also, for those who don't know, can you also just mention some of the Union Square Hospitality Group, aside from Daily Provisions?
Sure.
What are some of the restaurants that you guys own and start?
Sure. So Daily Provisions, as you mentioned, is a fine casual brand. We have 5 of them today, 1 under construction, and our goal is to open 3 this year, all in New York. In terms of the full-service fine dining restaurant, starts with Union Square Cafe, Danny's iconic restaurant. that is approaching 40 years. And in an era where many restaurants come and go, to last 39 years is pretty special and unique. Gramercy Tavern was his second restaurant, which is one of New Yorkers' favorite restaurant, Gramercy Tavern. We have the Modern, which is our three Michelin star restaurant. Tom Allen is this amazing young executive chef who he and his team are doing just a wonderful job at that restaurant. Very proud of them. We have Ci Siamo, which is our newest full-service fine dining restaurant in our portfolio that is in a project that is Brookfield's Manhattan West.
Okay. And
it is a rustic Italian restaurant where we infuse wood fire as a cooking platform with Hillary Sterling as our amazingly talented executive chef. So we also run and operate a really cool eclectic bar called Porchlight. We have, I'll mention one more, a really cool, authentic taco stand called Tacosina in Williamsburg.
Have any been started and then stopped?
The answer is yes, right? Danny created a restaurant that predates me called Tabla. That was here, and I don't know the exact year when that was created. And so that closed.
Okay, so like 1 out of 10.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we candidly, we had to close a few restaurants during the pandemic. It was a very difficult period for us and other restaurateurs in this city and across the country. We had a beloved Blue Smoke, which was our barbecue concept, and Jazz Standard, which was a jazz club below, and we sadly had to close that. Now I aspire, and Danny, we aspire to bring the Jazz Standard back to life. But yes, we have closed restaurants.
Interesting. Okay. So what was I just going to ask you really quick? Oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, okay. So from Darden then to USHG, but how? How did you get this job?
Sure. At Darden, as I mentioned, I rejoined Darden. I was the zone vice president for Red Lobster, and I oversaw about 95 restaurants. And a couple of years later, I became head of operations. Got promoted to EVP and COO for Red Lobster. Darden spun Red Lobster off to a private equity firm. And around 2017, I humorously say, Red Lobster was tired of me and I was tired of them. And that's okay. Stuff happens, right? I left Red Lobster in 2018, and I was very blessed to take about 14 months off. Got reacquainted with my lovely wife. To have lunch in the middle of the week and a glass of wine was like really cool. I also found some passion in one of my hobbies, which I collect rare and antiquarian books.
Oh, nice.
And about 10 months into my hiatus, I get a call from one of our board members, USHG board member, who was the former chairman and CEO of Darden Restaurants. And Clarence Otis has been a good friend. He's been a great sponsor for me. And Clarence called and said, Danny Meyer wants to talk to you. And I looked at the phone and I went, this can't be, right? And so that's how I was introduced to Danny. He and I had 2 calls. I flew to New York. We had about a 90-minute, 2-hour interview.
Did they fly you to New York? Did you fly there?
Yeah.
They flew you.
They flew me to New York. We had a call in mid-January. We had a call in early February of 2019. First week of March or thereabouts, I flew, and we had a wonderful interview. And but we had a very fast courtship, because I was the first candidate that Danny interviewed. I was being courted by 2 other groups. In fact, had received an offer. And I called Danny and said, I've so enjoyed spending time with you, but I have this offer. My grandmother once said, a bird in a hand, right? And so I said, Danny, I am sure you're going to want to interview a number of candidates. I have this offer, and
I don't have the time to wait around.
that was basically it.
Yeah.
And Danny said, give me 48 hours, and we struck a deal. And
wow.
It's been fantastic.
So you knew who Danny was?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
I tell the story. I read his book in 2008, Setting the Table. It was just a wonderful narrative about our industry and about leadership. I liked it so much, I ended up buying 115 copies of the book. And I gave it to, at the time, every one of my direct reports and then every one of my general managers at Red Lobster. This was a period when I was the zone vice president. That's how much the book and the content in the book influenced me.
Interesting.
And I'm like, I bought 115 copies. I gave it to every leader in my organization, and I gave them all homework.
Yeah.
The only way that I would know that they actually read it was to give them homework. And I gave them 90 days to essentially provide a book report.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I know that feeling too of when that phone call you must have had from Danny, because I remember this original podcast I had started that I ended up getting in front of Disney, and when I got a phone call from the VP of Radio Disney, who I cold pitched.
Yeah.
And it was that same like, oh my, what? Like me? Did you have imposter syndrome though during any of that? Like, I'm not ready for this, or you've been working at these more chain kind of groups, and now you're going to this elevated brand with like Michelin star dining, which is not like a Red Lobster.
Not at all. Yeah. What I would say is I probably had some nervousness. I'm not so much about imposter syndrome. I was confident in my ability to kind of lead and manage complex businesses. When I left Red Lobster, I made the conscious decision to say, the next chapter of my life, I want to run a small, intimate organization. And I purposely said I only want to run a company with 75 units or less. And I really missed the intimacy of being close to the business, right? When you're running an enterprise as large as Red Lobster, there were 705 restaurants. I had 8 vice presidents and 80 directors of operations. I barely knew the names of every one of my directors. And so I long wanted to get closer to the business. And so I had some nervousness because I wanted to be, I didn't want anyone to think that Danny was going to turn USHG into some massive chain, right? But I also had the confidence, as I mentioned earlier, of going to culinary school, being very comfortable in Michelin star restaurants. I was a sous chef early in my career at a French restaurant. So not imposter syndrome, just some natural nervousness. Yeah.
I started this consultancy business last year to help founders and executives and whatnot with their personal brand. And I find that nowadays, and I think Danny's a good example, right? I mean, you can think of even I think she's now the president or something, but the girl of In-N-Out Burger, she just did her first Today Show interview. The woman's like a billionaire.
Yeah.
But a lot of executives, venture capitalists, founders don't want to write books and be the face of the company. In this day and age, do you think that's important? Like you even taking the time to sit with me on this podcast.
Yeah.
When you're not an influencer or out parading around the streets doing TikToks.
Yeah. I think it starts with the individual's kind of purpose and why they do what they do.
Yeah.
I personally believe I have a role, and whether I want to be a role model or not, that I am a role model, particularly to people of color, men and women in their 30s and 40s that aspire to do more. I have a purpose that says I want to wake up to ensure that I am nurturing and grooming the next generation of leaders. I make no apologies about my focus being women and people of color. Of my C team, all are women, and 2 are of Asian descent. And that's my chief marketer, chief legal, chief people, chief financial officer, all women. And and my chief technology officer, who's absolutely brilliant. And so for me, at this point in my career, in addition to running this with Danny, wonderful company, I wake up every single day thinking about how can I shape the next generation of leaders, both in USHG and then outside of USHG.
No, that's very nice because a lot of people, especially at your level, they don't have to care, right?
Yeah, it drives my EA crazy, right? Because yes, I do get on any given week 4 or 5 LinkedIn messages. I speak at conferences and people grab me and say, hey, can I chat with you? and my executive assistant, Ann, who's brilliant and does a great job. And I say to Ann, I have no time except for Saturday morning or Sunday morning. And so on any given weekend, I may spend 2 hours talking to people I've just met.
Yeah. That's how I feel. It's like that excitement
Yeah.
about, I don't know, it's like you can give back, right?
Yeah.
In a way.
And when you sent your email, I was so intrigued with your story and your background. And somewhere I saw this notion of fearless, and I love that phrase. And you talk a lot about, you personally do, of the challenges and obstacles that you've had to overcome. That resonates with me because growing up again in an economically depressed area with a single mom, like I've had to overcome challenges. And so I applaud you and congratulate you for what you've been able to do. It's remarkable.
You're going to make me cry, and I can't cry before I have 2 more questions for you. Oh my gosh, no, that was very sweet. I appreciate that. And that's, I feel the same about you. So I'm just really honored that you took the time and are giving this wisdom. But one of my last questions for you is, you mentioned, you flew to New York for the interview with Danny, and I'm a big advocate for in-person conversations. And I mean, I work for myself, so I've never necessarily applied for a job aside from Disney, and I was living in LA at the time to take that meeting. But I have put tickets on a credit card sometimes at the beginning of my career to fly if there was an executive or something I was trying to pitch. And a lot of people would be like, oh, let's just do a phone call. But I always find that in person so different. So if Danny had not, or Union Square had not been like, let's pay for your flight, but we would like to take a meeting with you, would you have flew to New York? You would have.
Train, taken a boat,
yep,
a car.
You would have, okay.
I mean, I think to your point, there is power in seeing a person live and in color, for lack of a better term, and watching their eye contact and facial. And if you're curious, and I've talked a lot about that, I want to see and feel the whole person, right? And and the technology is great, and Zoom we have to do, but there's nothing that can replace a firm handshake, a look into someone's eye, to see their body language or their facial tics when I may say something unique or odd. And yes, I would have paid for my own airfare.
Okay, good. So everyone who's listening and gets even a gut feeling of something, that in person really matters.
Yeah.
Do you have one piece of advice that you've been given that was the worst and the best career advice throughout your career?
There's not one. All right, I've been very fortunate to be able to get a number of what I call nuggets of insights or learning. I heard this saying, and it's not mine, but I've lived by this, from Ken Frazier. Ken, again, former black CEO of a pharmaceutical company. And this was advice his dad gave to him. And I learned this about 4 years ago, but I have subscribed to this my whole life. And I'm going to try to get the quote right. And his dad said to him once, Kenny, what other people think about you is none of your damn business. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant advice. And for me, I've placed very little time or energy of what other people think about me. Now, I want to be respected. I want to be valued, but and I'll wrap up with this piece, which is our company right now today, we're going through our end of the year review cycles, right? And at 60, I've been reviewed by great people, a handful of knuckleheads, some really just great leaders, and just shitty bosses, right? I've honestly never really placed a lot of stake in what they say. I mean, I take their advice, but I never walked away from a review going, oh my God, I can't believe they said this about me. And the advice is about this confidence that I want people that I want to have. It's not arrogance. It's just like, I believe in what I'm doing. And if you rate me a 2 or a 3 and the scale is 5, then I'm essentially going to prove to you that I can get to a 5. So I apologize for being long-winded. Ken Frazier's advice his advice that his dad gave to him really resonated with me, and that's how I tried to live my life.
Well, what a perfect and fearless way to wrap up. Chip, you have been a true pleasure.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Me too.
Yeah.
For everyone who wants to find out more about Union Square Hospitality Group and Metro Podcast, where we're filming today, go to the show notes. You can plug social media, your LinkedIn. I know you're not a big Instagrammer,
No.
but LinkedIn, I'll also put that in the show notes as well. And thank you, everyone, for tuning back into another episode of The New Unfiltered.